I was actually involved with Seneca Army Depot for multiple years before the encampment. I was part of a group called Catholics Against Nuclear Arms. Now, you got to understand that some of us, okay, Mark was part of Catholic Worker and had started paying attention to flights in and out of there, trying to get information. I think he petitioned some kind of federal web. They didn't have web in those days, but he was trying to he got information from the federal government, as I understand, and there were things that just didn't add up. Now, I was very involved in anti-Vietnam War stuff, starting with the Varricchio's action in Baltimore, and I marched in support of that. So there were a group of, when Mark found out this stuff, word sort of went out, and I didn't know him before that, among some people in the Catholic community that were concerned about what he had found, and we got together, I want to say at St. Joe's Catholic Worker, and he was talking about what was down there from what he had been able to investigate. And at that point, nobody knew what was in there. We felt an obligation to raise consciousness about what was there from what he was able to glean from various sources. And we decided, you know, sometimes terrible things can happen in the world because of ignorance. And if nothing else, we were going to call attention to what was there and to try and smoke out what the facts were best we could. So it was on the head of that we started going down there on a regular basis, leafleting, talking to local people who worked at the depot whenever we could, doing more research ourselves, asking questions. And then it was sometime after that the women went to Greenham, and then at some point a group of women in Rochester decided to do a Greenham. So the first time I met with them and they were talking about this, I said, well, I had some practical problems with that, because in Greenham what they kept doing is just moving them off of the side of the road, and you know, you can't get much going that way. I mean, they got some things going, but I said, you know, I think we ought to buy land down there, and they can't move us from the land. Oh, that was interesting. Well, where would we buy it? Somebody said. Well, I said, well, we've been driving down there on a regular basis, and I could remember this little old house that was all run down with lots of weeds growing in front of it that was for sale. I mean, you know, you go down there every other week at 5 o'clock in the morning, because that's when we did it, when the workers were going to work. So, you know, we're leaving here. I mean, we're talking winter. We're talking rain, snow, sleet. No matter what, we would drive from Rochester down there to the depot. And we were doing it for years. So you got to know the terrain. So, well, that was sort of interesting. So they kind of deputized me, and I don't remember who else, to go check out some land. So we went down, and I, you know, found a realtor to find out what the story on this piece of land was, that this little old house and some farmland around it, which was right next to some Amish people. I thought that was kind of nifty in terms of just peace-loving people. So we walked the land, and I had no knowledge at the time I started looking at this house that it literally abutted the depot. Until we walked all the way back, and my gosh, there was a gate, and I thought, well, the Holy Spirit's working here. And as I recall, the land was like $37,500. Well, we didn't have any money, but we decided we should buy it. And so we started raising money and getting lawyers, and, you know, we put a purchase offer on it, and the case encampment was slated, I don't remember when that would have been, but I'm going to say it was in the winter. And the peace encampment was slated to open Memorial Day, and by Memorial Day we'd raised enough money, and it was paid for. I mean, people began to hear about it early on, because the word went out, and there were some people who had been involved with women's music festivals and stuff like that. I mean, those people knew a lot about building, because we wanted to make it handicapped accessible. We had to deal with things like public health laws, and we had to have a public health permit to do it. And that was no small deal, because Seneca County is small, it's Republican, it's got one of the most conservative people in the state legislature for a state senator. There are a lot of folks who control things down there, big time. I mean, their basic income was the Army Depot and the dump and prisons, okay, and a state psychiatric hospital. So they were very into, this is our way of life, you're not going to disturb it with these women. And, you know, we don't want this Army Depot to leave, because this is a major industrial industry for the county. So, you know, when you work in healthcare, you know there's a lot of politics, and I work in healthcare. So one of my concerns was whether we were going to be able to get the public health permit. But, you know, we went and determined what was required in terms of sanitation and water and all those things, and we just went about it with a real commitment that we were going to accomplish it, and I don't think there was ever a question in anybody's mind this was going to happen. And we found a guy. Now, Cana had been involved in peace movement stuff for a long time, so one of the people, and there was different churches in town that worked, one of the churches had one of the guys from, and he wasn't part of the Catholic group, who worked at RIT as a civil engineer. And he was from Pittsford, and he came down and basically helped figure out what had to happen in terms of all the water systems. And we rented porta potties, but we had to figure out what the ratio of those kind of things. I mean, now I've always done planning, so, you know, some of us could conceptualize things. You give me the regulations and the specs, and I can work on that. But then you had a lot of women who were just, there was nothing they couldn't do with a hammer and a saw, and if it needed to be built or raised, they'd do it. So the women, from the time we took possession of the land, and, you know, we had people volunteer legal services. I mean, people were just volunteering lots of stuff. Now, one of the issues was, like, it was supposed to be women-only space. That created huge issues. Well, in multiple ways. First of all, that assumed you had a woman that could do everything that needed to be done, like the civil engineering things. And I think the water systems was a place where we didn't. I mean, we had women working on it. Marcia Craig, who has since died, was one of those people. But, you know, there were guys that were simply needed. Plus, you also had, I mean, Mark, who first discovered the base, you know, and it was him that raised the consciousness to begin with. You know, the guys were only allowed up front in the tent where they sold stuff. And if you want to be nonviolent, I think a lot of the guys felt this was right. Felt that they were, in some ways, that this was violence toward men by being exclusive of men. That took quite a bit of conversation. I mean, there were a lot of issues that over the course of developing the camp became major points of controversy. And they had decided early on that everything would be done by consensus. I have facilitated meetings since 1967 on a consistent basis. Starting when I was in student government in college. And I still do a lot of it now as part of my planning work. I'm here to tell you, I learned that I will never bind myself to consensus again. I have always tried to get a group to find points of agreement and consensus, but consensus, when you really do it the way they did in the beginning, becomes the tyranny of the few, and it was really a problem. But yeah, women from Ithaca started coming up. There were quite a few women that came up from Ithaca and started coming from Albany and other parts of New York State. And then, by the time the camp opened, I mean, we had a march for people coming in from all over. I had been involved with the Berrigans, and Liz McAllister and some of those people came up from Baltimore. I used to live in Erie, and there were people from Erie, including some of the Erie Benedictines who had been involved in Pax Christi. I mean, people came from all over the country and Europe. And then I know before it started, there was a march with Buddhist monks and nuns that came from, it started in Brockport and came into the Universalist Church downtown. And I know my daughter would have been 9 at the time, 8 or 9. No, I meant, that was, she would have been about 10. And she walked I walked it, but she did too. And, so that there were just all kinds of things. Bread and Puppet Theater came that summer. You name it, they came. And it was designated from the beginning to be women's space. And I think that meant different things, and it came to mean different things over time. And when we talk about how we paid for things, one of the things we did was had bumper stickers and pamphlets and all kinds of things, T-shirts. Oh, lots of T-shirts got sold. I probably still have a few of those. So there were things like that got sold, and so that raised money too. I think it's my lot in life to always be the monkey in the middle. There was something very exciting about women-only space, even for married women. On the other hand, I mean, the empowerment that went on around that, I think, had a profound impact on Rochester generally. And bring me back to that issue if I don't continue it right now. I think on the issue of women-only space, my druthers would have been to find some alternative ways to make spaces on the land accessible to men at different times, and for different purposes. I mean, when Cain had demonstrated, or we got arrested, I mean, men and women both did, okay? And I think hospitality should be inclusive and not exclusive. So that's where I was coming from. On the other hand, if you had women living on the land, and I was very sensitive to the fact that women had been physically and sexually abused, that we had to be mindful of that. And if they were sleeping on the land. However, there were other things, some women decided they were going to go topless. That's an example. And, you had a farm of, with migrant children next door, including little boys. I just felt that was abusive. If this is something that women choose to do, that's fine. Do it at home. Do it at some camp. But, let's not mix up what our messages are here. And those kind of things became, in my opinion, and I think if you read the local papers, a source of a lot of criticism, because it did violence to local people. And I don't think you do that. I think you do everything you can to be a good neighbor. And I think some of us were working on that, and other people were trying to be as feminist as possible. And you had conflicting agendas that I don't think had to conflict. So it was those kind of things. So I was someplace probably in a fairly moderate position compared to where some other people were. I mean, we started it, and I think some of us felt some responsibility to try and keep some kind of reins on it, so it just didn't become I mean, issues of substance use on the land. You know, I think they're just things that, in my mind, we started it with one purpose, which was to bring attention to Seneca Army Depot and get rid of those weapons. And to me, I didn't want a whole bunch of other people's agendas getting in the way of what should be the focal point. Now, are there connections between different forms of violence? Sure there are. But, you know, you need to make those carefully and not just wildly. I think it had a huge impact in terms of the camp itself on the Rochester community. I think it was a time that a lot of women in Rochester came in touch with their own sexuality. People who may have been living with other women in what they considered private lesbian relationships, and maybe not even naming them. This is just a woman I happen to love kind of thing. Really got in touch with what it meant to be lesbian and came out. It's pretty hard to be down there if you're a lesbian and not be out. But so I think for a lot of us, summer of '83 was a huge turning point in that sense. But it also, this thing was really, really well covered by the press, especially the local press. There were several people in the local press who were just excellent. One who was from Seneca County that did a really good job and an even-handed job covering it, I think. So a bunch of things started to happen. One, you had women accomplishing something as primarily as women in Seneca Falls that who would have thought, you know, that what could happen in Romulus, New York. Okay, you had, and it was all being reported not only here but all around the world, and people coming from all around the world, and people thinking this couldn't happen to begin with, and it did, on time, paid for, yada yada yada. Lots and lots of people being arrested, and more information coming out over time, and you know, so the paper started investigating it too. But you then really developed a women's community here in Rochester. I think there was probably a women's bar scene. This was different. This was a women's justice, you know, women's peace and justice scene. And then the women connected with the Ithaca women and other women, and, you know, so that was good too. But I also think that place was made handicapped accessible from the beginning. There were things like that just connected the ways that you need to be inclusive and nonviolent, you know, whether you were talking about toward the earth or toward one another, to be inclusive of all, welcoming of all. So I think that I mean, Rochester has a history, you know, from women's suffrage to the Underground Railroad, and just a whole host of things with race issues and women's. So I think that a lot of that history of, you know, the Susan B. Anthony, the stuff at Seneca Falls with women's movement, you know, the issues of racism in Rochester. There's a liberal underground, but Rochester used to be, when I first moved here, a fairly conservative. I mean, they used to call it Smoketown, USA, and it was, you know, corporate, Kodak corporate. You didn't unionize, you didn't do lots of stuff, and then you started having all this stuff going on. I mean, that was pretty much a culture clash. And then we decided to march in the Memorial Day Parade. It might well have been the second year, but we literally had death threats, and we were trying to decide whether to march or not. And I can remember that meeting vividly, because I'm pretty sure it was the second year. Yeah, now the Memorial Day Parade is your typical, you know, military kind of things. The women decided we were going to march anyway, and we got a separate parade permit. And they started having death threats on certain women's lives. And there were different people coming to us saying that, the police came and met with us, I remember that, and said they were very concerned about these being real. But we talked about it and we said, well, what do we do? And they said, well, if you don't march, you'll never march again because they'll realize that they can intimidate you. And then we had a huge conversation because we had invited the world. But I felt strongly, and some of the other women did, that you couldn't, we were torn ethically because we didn't want people marching who didn't realize that their lives might be in jeopardy. But you didn't want to put that word out too far either. So we decided that anybody holding the Women's Peace Encampment banner, anybody doing peacekeeping, so they'd be on the periphery, and all of those people had to know what the stated risk was. We marched. The military chose not to, except the Vietnam vets. The Vietnam veterans marched. Now that was real. That tore me up because I had been, like I said, part of the Berrigan's initial marches in support of the Berrigans in Baltimore right after Catonsville, and had gone to marches all over Harrisburg and other places subsequent to that with them. And but the Vietnam vets came out, and a lot of us who would have been the same age as them, it was an incredible reconciliation between the anti-Vietnam War people and the Vietnam vets who were never welcomed home. And, that was just a really neat thing. Subsequent years, for a number of years, the marches continued, and the veterans decided they had to march. But every year there was a renegotiation with some of the old American Legion guys. And then the churches got into it over time, so that even today you continue to see church peace groups in the Memorial Day parades here. And Raging Grannies, and who were some of the people that were part of that peace encampment and part of the Cana. Things that happened down there were not just reported in the paper, but then were happening in Rochester, so that it kind of engaged the local community, because if they went to things like the Memorial Day Parade, there were those women. And I think all the issues around gay sexuality were heightened. Now, two things were happening coincidentally. You had the Women's Encampment that started in '83. The first cases of AIDS were diagnosed in this region in '83. So some of us were involved in AIDS work from the beginning too. And a lot of the issues with AIDS in the early days was homophobia. So in the healthcare side, those of us who worked in healthcare were doing, from the beginning, we made it very clear that you couldn't discriminate by disease for anybody. You shouldn't have separate units, because if you had separate hospital units, everybody would know it was an AIDS unit. Then you can't have confidentiality. These things are opposed. Any health professional was expected to care for anybody. And then we were talking about how we raise money. I forgot about that part. We went to the gay bars and a lot of men's bars. And frankly, I'd never been to some of these gay bars in my life. And we just went in raising money. And then we later did it for AIDS. But it was incredible. But an awful lot of money was coming from the gay male community in support of the encampment originally. And then later we did a lot of work with the bars to raise money for AIDS. I think probably the fact that the encampment happened and raised consciousness around sexual orientation and people feeling okay about being gay around the same time that AIDS was happening probably was a blessing in some ways. Because in this town then you had, and I don't know when they developed, but we had always had the oldest gay newspaper in the country. So there was always a gay group. But I mean, like Xerox and Kodak all had lambda groups for health benefits. Some of the first, probably some of the first in the country. The University of Rochester has, I mean, right now, even if you go there now, I mean, if I look at the nursing school, medical school, you've got and River Campus, you've got a lot of gay people who come to work here in town because it's gay friendly. And then you've got NTID and the large gay community at National Technical Institute for the Deaf. My partner and my daughter were down there a lot during the day because everyone was doing a lot of the money and just helping get it started. I was working. She was a teacher. So you had people who were teaching and things like that who could get down during the day. Most of us had jobs and we'd go down on the weekends. Yeah, so there were groups that were peace groups beyond the women's encampment groups, you know, different, most of them were religious based, but but the women's in peace encampment group was Rochester women who were planning it, and oh God, we had meetings and meetings. I guess I would say that the women from Rochester worked closely with the women on the land to really figure out all the logistics and how they were going to get it all set up. But it seems to me like the people who were from Rochester, I mean, and that was a huge range too. But I would say by and large the Rochester women were probably less radical than some of the women who had spent a lot of their time on things like women's music festivals and things like that. Or, you know, I can remember there was a group of gals from Ithaca who were into some kind of numerology or something. I mean, you had some really out there kinds of folks. I mean, it was women from just the widest range of women imaginable. And I mean, that's where you got into issues. So that if you had women who were just really into the height of women's stuff and Wiccan, and you know, and then you had people who were, you know, raising kids and teaching in school and just very basic, you know, your typical mother kind of person. I mean, you know, so I would say for the most part, Rochester did some transforming that summer. I think because it made the sort of the middle class professional women have to deal with what this other crowd, the issues that they were raising, and that was, you know, I mean, I think Rochester did a pretty good job with a lot of the what was I going to say? A lot of the women from Quaker Meeting got involved in it too, so they were really used to doing things by both consensus and nonviolence. So we had people who had histories in religious life, and several of us were involved as well, who had formerly been nuns, other people who were still nuns, so people who were used to living in community and trying to work with a range of women from a, you know, so you had a lot of different perspectives. And then you had people like Cindy, who are sociologists, and some of us who had other kind of social in our background. And you had anthropologists. I mean, you know, so you had wide ranges of people trying to understand, and how do you get a group as divergent and diverse as this to keep a singular focus at least long enough so that people don't totally miss the point of why this is here. And then what kind of, and there's an awful lot of education that went on. Not only, you know, so you probably remember, I mean, we would have, there'd be meetings on end, but then there would also be teach-ins, and that was good. I mean, there was an awful lot of good, using the gifts of women to broaden the perspectives of women. A lot of that kind of thing went on. There were kids down there. We had to deal with, at what age can boys remain on the land? You know, there were issues of food, what kind of food could be served, you know, that didn't do violence to other people's eating habits. Some of us were concerned about, let's just make sure that we don't have any, you know, foodborne outbreaks. It was enormously exciting. I mean, you took a house that had pretty much fallen into disrepair, and I don't know whether it was true. The word was that a couple of older women had lived there, and then, you know, I'm not sure what happened to them, but they moved, and so it was just sitting there in disrepair. And to bring it back to life, and to clean out barns and get all those outbuildings so that you could use them, and to build space, you know, spaces on the land that for people for meetings, and to have, I mean, it was theater at times. I mean, you know, you would have walks to the depot and all kinds of signs and banners and things going up on the house. I mean, you know, and then you had your onlookers just coming to see what were these crazy women doing. So I think I loved it, because, I mean, my whole thing had been from the beginning, how do we bring attention to the depot and get rid of these nuclear arms? And there was no, you know, there was no way you could control what was going to happen down there. It became organic, and it grew of its own and took on a life of its own that was way beyond any group of individuals or single vision. I mean, it was just organic is the only way I can think of it. And then people who liked it and didn't like it all got involved. But even that brought attention to what was going on. I mean, I can remember one night, probably one of the scariest evenings of my life, being on the land, and the word went out that all of the ammo in all of the Kmart's and stores where you might sell ammunition had been sold out, and that the local guys had been meeting at the American Foreign Legion or Veterans or one of those places, and that they had decided that they were going to go rabbit hunting down at the camp. And that was scary. That was really, really scary. And I mean, it was all over the CBs. And, you know, these are the guys that carry their shotguns in the back of the trucks. That was probably fairly close to the time when they had the Memorial Day Bridge thing, too. I mean, and then there were different times when people would come, and I think it was the day of the Memorial Day March on the bridge, and I was back on the land that day, and we had communication with the head of the state police, and I want to say the governor's office. And I mean, you know, I mean, that was the other thing is, you know, this is before cell phones. And so you were dealing with phone services and people having the ability to cut your phone service if they wanted to locally. And trying, you know, safety had to be a priority. I mean, if we're doing this in the name of peace and disarmament, and people started getting violent, that was just flying in the face of everything that we should be about. You know, so there were times when we literally were calling out the state police to serve as security. And we did our own security to begin with, but you also had, you know, they were there to be of support. We had, I think Bella Abso came to the land. I mean, there were, you know, a number of women in government who, you know, in Congress and stuff who came, but we always had security all night long. You know, you had women doing security all night in various places on the land, but the only thing you had was walkie-talkies. And then you were dependent upon calling the local police. you know, and the county sheriff, you know, so you're really dealing with county sheriff and walkie-talkies, and, you know, if a bunch of guys on a hot summer night get tanked up at the American Legion Hall and decide they're going to put those women in their place, you literally were sitting ducks out there. You know, and it never happened, but it was definitely on the CBs, and that was scary. I mean, that night, I said, we're going home. I mean, there are limits to, in my mind, we have a small child, and, you know, there are just limits of how many risks you're going to take. We had women who lived on the land who really met routinely with public officials and the sheriff and the county health department. And there were certain kind of messages we wanted to send. We wanted to do this in a way that was absolutely nonviolent. And that was cooperative. And some of us felt strongly about what should happen to that land at the end of it, in terms of turning it into some kind of a peace education thing. I mean, you know, the second, third, fourth years, I mean, one of the issues really became how did the land get used in the end? And that became problematic because some of us felt you should be able to get grants and do an ongoing peace education kind of thing, justice education, seminars, and other people simply wanted to live there for free. You know, so there were some real conflicts of what that would be about. You know. Before the encampment opened, we were down there a couple weeks just before, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday morning, and I think it was a major from the base came out. Now this had not happened before. By now the word was out that he was retiring. So I went over and introduced myself and congratulated him on his upcoming retirement. And he said, "Oh, you don't need to introduce yourself, Lynn." He said, "We know all about you." Now, a lot of us who were really kind of, I suppose, central figures in the planning of some of this had the sense that our phones were tapped. I am not a paranoid person. And I said, "Oh," he says, "Oh, yeah, I can tell. I could tell you where you live. I probably know more about you than you would ever dream." And now this is just the group from Cana, but you know he was going to retire and teach at a boys' military academy. And I said, "Well, you know," I said, "How do you feel about retiring now that the encampment's coming?" He said, "I think it couldn't be better." So my feeling was, well, if nothing else. I mean, I can't remember what the exact words were, but I had the feeling that he got the message that maybe this wasn't necessarily a good thing that was going on there, and he was just as glad to be out of it, and God help the guy that was going to be there next. But, I mean, interesting. I mean, like I said, we always did, Cana always did liturgical actions. And when we were arrested, they were always in the context of prayer and some kind of liturgical symbolisms. But I mean, some of the things that we ended up doing that were on the land too were interesting. Like one time we dug under the fence with teaspoons. You know, when they're coming at you to arrest you for violating their space, and you're doing it with teaspoons. I mean, we did things to make it, you know, you're dealing with nuclear weapons that can destroy what, and we've got teaspoons as our weapons. You know, it was sort of, and those things got reported. So part of it was the creativity of people to be able to make the connections between violence and nonviolence, and to realize which was we did everything we could to make it as clear as possible, you know. And I was watching the Daily Show the other night, a couple nights ago, and I had to laugh because it was the same kind of he was quoting President Bush's warnings to the Soviet Union that in this day and age you cannot invade another country and depose their leadership and knock down their statues. He starts to laugh, and and just the irony and a lot of the peace encampment was fun because I think there was a whole lot of humor around the ironies of the way the world is ordered and the way a women's order would be, the differences between like I can remember a lot of people. I'm a pretty serious person, and people would say, "Why don't you have a sense of humor?" And I realized down there I laughed a lot, but it was what I realized is so much of humor historically in this country has been sexual and demeaning toward women, and I never found that funny at all. On the other hand, some of the stuff that was being said down there, it was within your own cultural context, and it was really funny. So I think things like that changed individuals, and there was enough of a critical mass of people from Rochester and the surrounding communities that I think a lot of those things got changed. I would go down periodically, but I not nearly as much as some of the other women locally. Every once in a while there would be an item and something would come up and some of us would go down. But I think the real big issue in the second and third year was what was going to happen to the land. And the women on the land had their own view of life, and I really had a problem with it. And I just decided, after we'd meet and couldn't figure out a way to, resolve it, because of the way things had been set up. I think eventually it became a women's land trust and some other things happened. And Cindy was mostly involved in a lot of that. And by that, so I'd say I was probably involved quite a bit in the second summer. And then by the third summer, and after that, not much. Yeah, I think Cana continued to do its stuff. I don't honestly remember when we stopped that. I mean, we did it before, we did it during, and I believe we continued to do that for some time, yeah. Oh, yeah, I've been arrested a few times down there. One time that I was arrested, let's see, I'm trying to even remember. One time I was arrested, it was a large group of Cana and a large group of Catholic people had come together. I think the Sisters of St. Joseph and the Sisters of Mercy had all come down, and we had an evening liturgy, and we had the Paschal candle down there because it was Easter season. So afterwards, I took the Paschal candle and went through the gate, and that was meaningful to me because the Paschal candle is a symbol of Jesus Christ, light of the world, and the idea of taking the light into the darkness. And I was arrested that night, and it was, I think what really struck me is sometimes the Holy Spirit just works. I am not somebody that is given to using a lot of scripture in response, but when the soldiers arrested me and the different statements that they made, there were things coming out of my mouth that had to be divine inspiration. And the soldiers, I was connecting what they were doing with what the scripture said fundamentally. And how what they were doing really is at odds with Christian scripture. And the looks in their eyes, I knew they were uncomfortable because it was very, it's like making that word come alive and showing them the disparity with what they were up to and, what the gospel said. So that was one time. I know there were massive demonstrations too. And I know that what I remember most about that was, I can't remember how many people got arrested at one of those, but Cana, and maybe that was part of the Spoons, I don't remember. But we got arrested and went into the camp, and they had these outside holding areas. Guantanamo's probably the penultimate of that kind of thing, but they had sort of pens. And we were taken back to an area and put in holding pens after being searched. And a bunch of there's this wild cheer that went up. Cana's here, Cana's here. And, I think our group had kind of been a sort of a rock of stability or something. I don't think a lot of women really knew what to make of it, except that there was a level of respect simply because we'd been there doing this so long. When the second time I got arrested, there was a real concern because I had you first time you get arrested, they give you ban and bar letters. And the second, which means you can't come back under, if you're rearrested, that you'll do time, is what we were all told. And then so I had already had a ban and bar letter from Cana Actions. Right. So when we got arrested with the other thing, the question was whether we were going to be put in jail. And we went to the courthouse. Some people had attorneys, some people didn't. And in the final analysis, they dropped the charges. No, I think it was a matter that I think they had to figure out what was going to be more. It was going to end up being a lot more bad publicity. When you think about what you're arresting somebody for and putting them in jail, and the amount of cost to the government to arrest you, put you in jail, you're out of work, and it doesn't look real good when you're arresting certain kinds of people. And the more they did it, one of the songs that we used to sing down there is, you take one more, what is it? You take one woman and 10 more will come. And that was happening. So, if they started putting women in jail, or men, there were a bunch of people who were committed to replacing every one with 10. I did the actions, and Evelyn was willing to support that. We had to explain it to my daughter, and but I really think that there are things that are worth going to jail for. So that wasn't, I pretty much made that decision around the Vietnam stuff. And it's when all the stuff started happening with Desert Storm and the next, the more recent war in Iraq, I think a lot of people in Rochester felt very anti-war. And yet, what was kind of frustrating, I'm sure to some people, is I now have a young son that I adopted from Cambodia, and I'm not in a position that I can just now go off and get arrested and stuff like that. But I think, and some of the women from the encampment are still part of Raging Grannies, and they're still doing it. And I give them a lot of credit. And, and I think in the Rochester community, if we ever got all of our energy together, there's still a lot of people who are willing to do major resistance. I feel badly that more has not been done around Iraq, but Metro Justice, Downtown Presbyterian Church, Spiritus Christi, there's just lots of peace groups here in town of different sorts and different justice work that people are still involved in. I think I've always been concerned about peace and justice. I still am. I do work in healthcare justice. I adopted my son because of concerns about the injustice toward Cambodian prostitutes around the AIDS issues. They were using some gels with Cambodian prostitutes, and a lot of them got infected. I think I got my values from a Mercy College in Erie, and I think I've took that to it, and that's still who I am and still the kind of work I do. I have not remained real involved in the women's community at all. Not that I don't care about it, it's just my life and the things that involve my life are in a different dimension. I have, since '83, I've been out professionally as a lesbian professional woman. I started a group at my church, which has gone national, Lesbian and Gay Family and Friends, which is now being carried out by somebody else. So I think that part of it, when I went to divinity school, anything that I've ever done since then, I've been very clear about who I am. I've spent 10 years working in AIDS, and that was a real resource. So I think probably the biggest thing for me was just being out as a lesbian woman professional and being able to model, you can live a very normal life. You know, the world's not going to stop. They're not going to shoot you. And that, I think that has probably been the biggest change in my life, and I think has been helpful to other people to realize that, you know, it's like any other ism, that if people are willing to be themselves and just live in their own skin and be willing to talk about whether it's racism or homophobia or any other kind of ism, you know, that we can all work at getting this together. And, you know, I do health services research, and anybody doing research is supposed to look at outcomes. The fact of the matter is Seneca Army Depot was dismantled. Did we have something to do with that? Can I prove it? No, I can't prove it, but I guess I really strongly believe that it's sort of like Area 51. If enough attention is brought to something that people don't want attention being paid to, the Army has a way of shutting it down, moving the location, what have you. And it happened. And I don't think that would have happened if the encampment hadn't been there and all the attention had been paid. Because even we had, during the time I was there, local people would come up to me and say, talk about people who had gotten cancer, relatives who worked there. And I've always been concerned about the toxic stuff that has been deposited in that land, and the health risks it posed. So, you know, I really think that we tried to go in there saying to the people, local people, you have an alternative economy, you know, that let's try and imagine what that could be. You don't have to have these kind of risks for your health. And the kind of work you're doing is life-denying globally. We should be able to come up with something more life-giving and creative. And I think things have moved, and I hope we were at least a small part of why that happened.